Hey guys, so today we're reading through Genesis chapter 12 through 15. And in our reading, there will be four main parts I want us to pay attention to. The first is God's call of Abram. The second is the famine and temptation of Abram. Third is Melchizedek, tithing, and communion. And finally, there is God's covenant with Abraham. To begin today's reading, we are introduced to one of the most famous people in the entire Bible, Abraham, the father of faith. Now, in this part of the story, he has not yet received his new name, Abraham. He is just Abram for now. And our reading begins with God approaching Abram with a proposition. He tells Abram to go to some foreign land, and God leaves out the details, as he often does with propositions like this, and continues by saying that he will bless Abram and his family and make them into a great nation. Now, there's something interesting to note about this proposition. He proposes to make Abram a blessing, in order that he might be a blessing to others. And here God introduces the idea of blessed to be a blessing. This is another major theme throughout the Bible that I hope you look out for in the future. Anytime God blesses humanity, it is so that it can be a blessing to humanity. Now, this is contrary to what we typically think of when we think of what being blessed looks like. Typically, we think only in terms of how we benefit from the blessing, rather than how our blessing will bless not only ourselves, but those around us. Which is precisely the whole idea behind our individual identities, which I will touch on later when God gives Abraham his full identity as Abraham. Okay, so more on that later, but let's get back to the story. So Abram responds to God's proposition in faith, and without even asking a single question, he just starts moving, the Bible says. And this faith of Abram sets the stage for the rest of his life. So pay attention to how Abram wrestles with faith throughout his life, because it's vital to not only his individual identity, but the identity of the nation God is seeking to build up through Abram and his family. So the story progresses, and we see Abram moving his family throughout the land God has called him to, and all seems to be going well. And at this point in our journey through the scriptures, you have probably picked up on the whole when things are going well, something's about to happen theme, and this part of the story is no different. Famine arises and scarcity spreads. Desperation sets in for Abram, and he feels the need to do something, and this is completely normal. And Abram has some options. He can trust in the Lord's plan and wait upon further direction in faith, or divert from faith and seek to solve the problem himself. This is yet another reference back to the decision presented to Adam and Eve that took place in the form of two trees in the Garden of Eden. Humanity can trust the Lord and walk in faith that God truly does have our best interests in mind, or divert and give in to our fears that he doesn't and seek to solve problems ourselves. Unfortunately, Abram chooses the latter of the two options and heads for Egypt. Now, something you must understand about Egypt in the Bible is that it represents the world, or help apart from God. The prophet Isaiah would eventually write, "What sorrow awaits those who look to Egypt for help, trusting their horses, chariots, and charioteers, and depending on the strength of human armies instead of looking to the Lord, the Holy One of Israel." Egypt represents a dependence upon something or someone other than God, and it's not good. So, upon his arrival in Egypt, Abram realizes that the Egyptians may desire his wife, Sarai, and kill him. So in a desperate attempt to save and preserve his life, he tells his wife to lie about her true identity and say that she is his sister. Okay, so pause. Two big things we need to learn from this. Number one, lying is never a good idea. And if anyone knows anything about lying, it's that the truth always comes out. And secondly, seeking to preserve your life apart from God is never a wise thing to do and doesn't work out the way we think it does. So you should start to be seeing how quickly things can not only go wrong, but then our mistakes pile up on top of each other. Not seeking the Lord leads to going to Egypt, which leads to lying about who we truly are, which leads to getting into more trouble than we were already in the first place. Okay, back to the story. So Abram lies. Pharaoh's princes find favor with Abram's wife. They take her in. Abram gets some goodies from Pharaoh, we're told, and now Abram is in a real mess. He's hit rock bottom. But if you know anything about our great and merciful Father of lights, It's that he is never late, and when the story appears to be over, he shows up and changes everything. And what do you know? God swoops in, drops some great plagues, and saves the day. Which, by the way, is a foreshadowing of God's rescuing of Israel from captivity in Egypt later on in the Exodus story. And God uses plagues there too. So, once again, the story progresses, and we hear a story about Lot. He gets into some argument with some herdsmen, which sounds like a typical day in the world we live in, people getting into silly disputes. And this leads to Lot leaving the group, the community he was originally in, and setting up shop near Sodom. And if you know anything about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you know that that was the worst possible place he could have chosen to set up. This decision leads to his eventual capture by some Mesopotamian king, and the first war in the Bible breaks out. Abram and his people win the war and rescue Lot. But that's not what I find most interesting about this part of the story. What I find most interesting is who they run into after the war, a king by the name of Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is by far my favorite character in all the Bible outside of Jesus, but I'll spare you my fandom and explain why he's important for this part of the story. Melchizedek is the only person outside of Jesus to be both a king and high priest. No one outside of them held both positions simultaneously. Ever. He is also the only person to ever be referenced in the likeness of Christ. And on top of that, he is also the first recorded king of Jerusalem. Now in the text it reads king of Salem. However, scholars conclude that Salem eventually turned into Jerusalem. And what is even more interesting about Melchizedek is that he is said to have no record of ever being born or dying. If you want to learn more about Melchizedek, check out Hebrews chapter 7. Okay, so after the war, Melchizedek presents Abram with bread and wine, which becomes the very first mention of those two elements together in the entire Bible, and a huge foreshadowing of Christ presenting his disciples with communion in the form of bread and wine. And on top of that, in this story, he becomes the first person to ever receive a tithe. This is also the first mention and foreshadowing of tithing in the Bible. Abram gives him a tenth of his earnings from the war. And so, in just a matter of a few verses, two of the biggest things in the entire Bible are introduced: tithing and communion, all surrounding one man, Melchizedek. Like I said, he's a pretty cool guy. Alright, there's one last thing I want to cover, and it's God's covenant with Abram at the end of today's reading. So we're told God comes to Abram in a vision, and he tells Abram to fear not, and that his reward will be great. Abram then responds by expressing his great fear of not having a child, and God responds back by saying that not only will Abram have a child, but that his offspring will be the number of the stars. And to seal this covenant, God calls for a blood covenant. And in case you don't know, blood covenants are the highest level covenant you can enter into. And let me explain why. If you break a blood covenant, the payment is your life, your blood. So you better make sure you can hold true to your promise before going into this covenant. And the way blood covenants work is two people would cut animals in half and walk through the cut halves and spill blood. Except in this story, as I'm sure you noticed, God diverts from the traditional way of doing blood covenants. Notice that only one person walked through, and it's God. He seals the covenant with himself, signifying that only one person can break it, and that his covenant is unconditional and comes with no heavenly strings attached.